Welcome back. Well, the Development Bank of Nigeria was well represented at the just concluded IMF World Bank meetings in Marrakesh. The managing director, Dr. Tony Okpanachi, who had a chat with our correspondent, John McQuarrie, shared their expectation for more funding and motivation to improve domestic revenue in a bid to accelerate impact in Nigeria. Take a listen.
Several development partners, and the World Bank is one of the major funders in terms of debt they provided us, and all our other development partners are also here, the likes of the AFD and so on and so forth. So it's an opportunity for us to also meet with our development partners and have some conversations and see how we can catalyze more funding for DBN going into the future.
So what will be your reaction to this conversation on we should, as Africa, we should not just be looking for funding. We should look for knowledge. We should look for how to improve our resources inwards instead of always looking for financing from outside.
That's a very good conversation, and actually, as you know, even at DBN, for example, if you look at our core mandates, one of the core mandates is technical assistance in terms of capacity building. So our knowledge is quite key. So financing obviously comes at the end, because if you don't have the knowledge, the capacity, how are you going to deploy the financing that you get? So it's quite important. And most importantly, in Africa, a lot of funding have been coming from outside Africa. There's also the conversation around how do we raise internal funding. For example, at DBN, we know that our initial funding came from the main partners. You recall we did just a bond issue of about 20 billion. We need to raise capital internally. That's in line with trying to also raise capital internally to be able to deploy to the mandates we have. So that conversation is quite important, and as African groups, countries, and partnering with other development partners across, it's good to begin to collaborate and see how we can internally also raise some capital too.
And there's also conversation about World Bank. I don't know if you were at Mo Ibrahim, and
I was a very interesting conversation there.
The issues around the ratings, maybe not being as objective as they should be, yes. Not taking into consideration, some of the things they should take into consideration, and even the World Bank itself, not being very clear about the implementation, of their objective and vision.
Yes. Well, that very interesting conversation, and then some very frank questions were raised by Mo, like you rightly said. I think from the institutional perspective, the World Bank is like, if you had the response from the president of the World Bank, yes, some reforms needs to be undertaken in terms of how do you make things happen quickly. Then on the rating side, how do you, when you rate African countries, and you say most African countries are not investable in terms of to enable them to have access to capital outside Africa. So the question is, what are the methodology do you use? What do you look out for vis-a-vis what is happening in other developing countries? And the question around it is, maybe if you come out with methodologies, look at for indices that you look at to show that a country is ripe for investment or investable in that company, in the country. Those are these conversations, are very hard discussions that have to be made. The rating agencies, they have a template, and the template appears to be cut across, but I think the question is, are you able to adapt them to meet the specific realities of African countries? And if you look at African countries, have there been issues of default? Rarely have we had that in terms of default. So I think that conversation is quite good. That how do we look at rating for African economies to ensure that you don't close them out from being able to have access to capital outside Africa?
But, I'm just thinking, must Africa continue to depend on this? Can we not find alternative to, waiting for the Bretton Woods institutions and, the developed economies, hand some things down to Africa?
Yeah, it's a good conversation. I'll give you the example of even at DBN, what we did, what we are doing, trying to also raise capital locally. I told you about the local bond which we issue. Yes, that conversation is real, because African countries, to the economies who can also catalyze local funding to be able to meet some of the requirements. But the point is, where we are now, I don't think in terms of funding, more is out there than we have in Africa. But that does not mean that as African countries, we should not begin to have that move towards trying to raise funding internally. So that conversation is good. As more Africans create those different instruments to be able to raise funds internally, that will help the conversation.
And when we talk about internally, I know that the World Bank president also challenged Africa, for instance, talk about intra-African trade. It's different. You're not new to it. We have AFTA, and yes, we're not making much of it. Is it Africans bringing Africa down?
No, that's not. I think this conversation has been on for a long time. After I've come, now some barriers that have been there, you're trying to break those barriers, which is very, very important. You have to break those barriers to inter-Africa trade. That's quite key. Issues of tariffs, issues about even logistics of moving goods around African countries and all that. Those are issues that you need to deal with. So it's not just talk about it, but these are practical issues that you need to deal with. And I think that's what AFTA is trying to do. And I to see the potentials in the inter-Africa trade is quite huge. But why it's huge, you also have to have mechanism, you have to have a structure in place to enable that to be galvanized into actual trade within Africa and grow the volumes. So, and that is where you have to deal with all these issues around tariff, like as mentioned. How do you ensure, for example, in Africa, even traveling within Africa alone, you have issues around visas, around that. So if you're not able to move goods, logistically within African countries, sometimes you have to go to Europe before you come back to African countries, or you have to go to other parts of the world before coming back to Africa. It's quite a huge challenge. So some of these things, building infrastructure across Africa that enable you to trade within African countries. For example, you talk about building highways across Africa so that goods can move around Africa. You begin to have African countries have joint projects. Like, for example, the gas project between Nigeria and Morocco. These are examples of things you can do that allow Africa countries to be able to trade among themselves. So this putting together all this, you need to ensure that you break all the barriers that has gone. So it's not just talking about it, it's actually ensuring that they work. And I'm happy that so many African countries have signed on to the AFTA, and we believe that should begin to get the conversation going in a positive way.
What should we be seeing after this? We have all the talks, great ideas, shared it, applauded. What next? Even if for no other country, for Nigeria, Nigeria is a participating country in this meeting. Yeah.
No, I think for Nigeria, it's again we have to be able to measure success by way of where are we? Do we have milestones we want to achieve? Do we have timelines to achieve those milestones? It's quite clear. So that it's not just talk. We say where are we in terms of the volume of trade we do now, in terms of balance of payment, balance of trade and all that, and we use that to make sure that we're making progress with other African countries. Now we also look at some issues that might be impeding trade within other African countries and ensure that as we break the barriers, we are measuring to see that actually in terms of volumes, numbers, they are growing. So it's not just talk about it. So where are we today? Where were we in 2021? Where are we in 2022? And so on and so on. So we have to deliberate about how we measure progress to ensure that it's not just talk around it. And for Nigeria in particular, I know there's some challenges around where you allow so many goods come in, whether there are issues around the domestic companies being at risk. But if we position domestic companies to be able to provide or produce competitive goods that meet international standards and are quite competitive, of course, the market is also there for that. So while the risk of maybe domestic challenges around domestic companies being threatened by free inter-African trade, there are also opportunities for you to also take your own goods out there in the outside market. So I think the deliberate action is how do we measure progress? And measure progress comes in specifics. Where were we last year? Where are we this year? And where do we plan to be in the coming year, and so on and so forth.
And this, I guess, would be the responsibility of the federal government of Nigeria or the coordinating Minister of the Economy. Thank God he's around.
Yes, that's the responsibility. And then, of course, we also have the Nigerian Export Promotion Council. You have the Investment Promotion Council and all that to look at where are we in terms of that. And, of course, the institutions that are also directly responsible for exports to see how are they increasing, are we increasing our exports given this window and this market that we have. So these are all that can be measured. But these figures they are quite straightforward to know where we are and where are we going.